Last lecture on the First World War, we're going to focus on the effects of it pretty much, or how it comes to an end and what that will mean for the future of the future of the United States and for the future of the world. And so Armistice Day is November 11th, 1918, and that's when the countries agree to a ceasefire, which means that the fighting stops, so the war is not technically over. And so that means that these nations have to go to a conference, right, to a meeting to form a peace treaty, a formal peace treaty. And President Wilson of the United States at the time, his mentality is that we should have war without victory, right? There shouldn't be, at the end of this peace process, there should not be a clear victor who takes advantage of other nations, because he believed doing so would not make the world more peaceful, would make it more dangerous. And his dream was to have a more peaceful world as a result of the resolutions at the end of World War I. And so he creates a really famous speech known as Wilson. It becomes known as Wilson's 14 points. And what these 14 points are, they serve as the basis for his vision of a post-war world. It's actually very unpopular with a lot of people because some of the things it's asking, like greater cooperation at the international level and things like that, go against nationalist ideas. It's unpopular for some empires. Excuse me. It's unpopular for some empires because it calls for self-determination, which is that ethnic groups or nationalities should be able to determine for themselves their political status. So in Austria-Hungary, for example, the Croatians or the Slovakians or the Czechs, right, they should be able to decide for themselves if they want to remain part of Austria or become their own nation. So this completely undermines and actually destroys the multi-ethnic empires of Europe at the time. And so with this idea of self-determination, which does kind of get its way through to the peace process, leads to the formation of many new nations. This peace process also leads, and what was called for in Wilson's 14 points was this idea of an international organization to settle disputes. And out of this peace process forms the League of Nations, which is exactly this, a worldwide organization that was meant to help settle future disputes. Right, so Wilson's goals in his 14 points, many of them do come through at the end of this peace process. But when they meet to make peace with Germany, each of the main Allied powers, so President Wilson of the United States, Clemenceau of France, Minister Clemenceau of France, and David Lloyd George of Great Britain, had different ideas in mind for what they wanted to get out of Germany and get out of this peace process. So Wilson and the Americans, who were the least affected by the war, they lost men in the fighting, but their nation wasn't destroyed, they weren't bankrupt or anything like that. And so they have a much more kind of idealistic idea of what should happen at the end of the war. They wanted to create the League of Nations to make sure future disputes could be settled peacefully. They wanted to ensure that Germany was not destroyed, right? Because they kind of wisely noted that if Germany is too badly weakened, it could cause future issues. It could cause instability. And on top of that, right, they did not want to blame Germany for the war. Germany ends up getting most of the blame for the war, even though in reality, the war started between Austria and Serbia, but Germany gets blamed for most of it, right? And so he wants to avoid doing that. And we'll see out of those 3 points, really only the first one of Wilson's is achieved. George Clemenceau of France. France was the country that probably suffered the most from Germany's actions because they were invaded. Lots of their territory was damaged, destroyed. They lost lots of men. And they had even lost territory from the Germans from earlier wars, like the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. And so the motivation of the French, and you can't really argue against them, I guess, to some extent, is they wanted revenge. And they wanted to punish Germany, right? And so one thing they want is to reclaim the territory Germany took from them in 1870, which is a region known as Alsace-Lorraine. They also wanted to not create a League of Nations. They were kind of opposed to the idea, or at least he was, Clemenceau was. He wanted Germany to pay reparations or war damages, so they wanted Germany to pay France for the damages they caused as a result of the war. And they wanted to end or disband the German army so they could prevent future attacks. Clemenceau actually gets a lot of these demands. Germany is punished severely. They are forced to pay reparations, and they do not disband, but severely limit the size of the German military. And France gets back this land of Alsace-Lorraine. So France kind of gets a lot of the aims they were going for, they do achieve. And then Lloyd George, right, he kind of is a hybrid, right? They wanted to achieve a just peace, So a kind of a balance between Wilson not blaming Germany and Clemenceau only blaming Germany. They wanted some kind of demand in the middle. But Britain's main effect in this war was they paid a large cost financially for this fight, and so their goal was to make some of that money back. To do that though, they needed reparations. So they also were supportive of reparations, maybe not as severely as France wanted, but they wanted some money from Germany to help pay back the war debt. They also wanted to retain a lot of their land for the British Empire. So we see at this time the multi-ethnic empires of Austria and the Ottoman Empire falling apart. Britain doesn't want to lose its territory, so they kind of want to keep that. And they want to do things to make sure Britain's naval supremacy is maintained. And they also achieve several of these things, right? Reparations kind of go back to the idea of paying the war debt. Much of the British Empire remains the same, and the limiting of Germany's army and navy helps protect Britain's naval superiority. And so the final product of this peace process is known as the Treaty of Versailles, because it was signed at Versailles, the Palace of Versailles, which is the old palace of the French monarch, so it's right outside Paris. This is done in June 1919. And some of the major things that come out of this are that 9 new nations are established in Europe, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Germany is forced to pay Britain and France the cost of the war, which bankrupts Germany, and the German people suffer high inflation and other economic issues, unemployment, and that's going to help set the stage for the anger that leads to someone like Hitler coming to power. So there's a real connection here between World War I and World War II. Austria-Hungary and Ottoman Empire no longer exist. They're all separate nations. The Ottoman Empire becomes Turkey, and a lot of its territories are broken up and given to other of the empires like Britain and France to be controlled. Right? There's also a war guilt clause, which forces Germany to accept responsibility for the war. The treaty is very unpopular at home. It also calls for the creation of the League of Nations. And many in America and many in the U.S. Senate do not want to be part of the League of Nations. And so even though that was Wilson's dream and idea for this organization to form, the United States Senate does not ratify this treaty. And in order for a treaty to take effect in America, it has to be ratified by the U.S. Senate. So what this means is that America does not join the League of Nations. So even though it was the brainchild of President Wilson, the Americans are not part of it when it's formed. Right, so this is what Europe and the Middle East looked like during World War I, 1915, and following World War I in 1923. You can see several new nations have formed, including Poland, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. The Ottoman Empire is now Turkey. And there's other countries in the Middle East like Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. So we have new changes developing here, right? There's also, we notice here, I want to point out the shaded region here in Western Germany, that was an Allied occupied zone, also known as the demilitarized zone as well. There was no German military allowed to be present there, and for a while the French and the British actually had a military presence there, right? So really geared at weakening France. So now I want to point out real quick that we can talk about a little more in class is that Russia is no longer called Russia in the second map. Now it's the USSR, or the Soviet Union, right? Because during World War I in Russia, there's actually a communist revolution that's successful, and the communists come to power, renaming it the USSR. But we'll talk more about that in class. And all this is going to set the stage here for the outbreak of World War II. And we can again talk more about that as we go through the next few units.